The theme of this year's Art History Talks on the Rock is introductions. So instead of presenting familiar artists, Michelangelo, Georgia O'Keeffe, and the like, this year I will be introducing you and or enhancing your knowledge of a range of artists who, while tremendously talented, have not risen to the status of household name. So I expect some of you will know one or two of the artists, but I would be really surprised if anyone were familiar with all of the artists that I will be presenting this year. In fact, 9 months ago, I would have struggled to name any Ukrainian artist. And yet, this one seems to come up again and again in the last few months. I first became aware of her work after reports that in the early days of fighting, Russian troops had destroyed the Ivankiv Ethnological and Local History Museum. Obviously not a military target. And what was particularly upsetting for Ukrainians was that this museum housed 25 of Maria Prymachenko's paintings, and they were presumed destroyed in this cataclysm. Now, I looked into her work, and I began to see it cited in the media, in various places online. I found a brilliant folk artist whose work was made in a tiny village in north-central Ukraine, but had international awareness and ramifications. And I thought that she would be an interesting figure to find out more about and to teach all of you about. And so I hope you enjoy learning about her as much as I have. Now, Prymachenko was born in the tiny village of Bolotnya, which is not on any map of Ukraine that shows the entire country, but we can find it if we look. Here's Kiev, and then north of Kiev there is Ivankiv, where that small local museum was destroyed, and just a few miles north of Ivankiv is Bolotnya, not on the map, too small. But you'll notice that not at all far away is Chernobyl, right there. Right there. That will become important later in our story. So she is born in Bologna to a family that had some skills, that reveled in Ukrainian folk art tradition. Her grandfather taught her to paint pizanki, which are the famous traditional wax resist Easter eggs made in Ukraine. And Ukraine's folk arts are a really central part of Ukrainian identity. These were made by a Ukrainian artist now based in New York City, but you can see the range of motifs: animal, vegetal, abstract. And these are all part of the range of motifs that the Ukrainian folk artist has at his or her disposal. Now, there are a couple of stories about the Pizanki, which go back to pre-Christian times. One is that it's the return of sunshine after a long winter. The yellow of the yolks symbolize the sun. But another story, also pre-Christian, tells of a monster in the Carpathian Mountains, the personification of evil. But the more Pizanki the people make, the tighter the chains are wrapped around the monster, keeping it at bay so it doesn't destroy the world. So you can sort of imagine how nowadays the making of Pizanki might be thought to be keeping the Russian advances at bay, and how Pizanki in Prymachenko's day would have had a variety of symbolic meanings, of those chains keeping the monsters tied up and immobilized. Her father was a carpenter and skilled woodworker. And in Ukraine, that doesn't just mean making chests of drawers, it also means decorating them with, again, that range of motifs, whereas her mother was a skilled embroiderer, like most Ukrainian women of her day. And embroidery in Ukraine has a tremendous importance in the culture. It's used to make ceremonial garments, wedding dresses, and so forth, but also everyday wear is embellished. And in Ukrainian, the word for embroidering a shirt is to write a shirt. So there is a tremendous amount of creativity expected of the Ukrainian embroiderer. You don't just embroider by rote. You don't just use the patterns that have been passed down to you, the ones that are typical in various parts of Ukraine, the roses, the oak leaves, the 8-pointed stars. All of these have symbolism. Everything we see here has some kind of symbolism, the colors as well, predominantly black and red, but other colors as well. But the embroiderer is expected to take this syntax and to write original visual prose in every shirt that he or she, that she embroiders. That was traditionally a female province, although nowadays there are men embroidering too. Now, young Maria Prymachenko came of age in this very artistic family, but her mother was not primarily an embroiderer, her father not primarily a wood carver, but they were primarily peasants. They had to feed themselves by the work of their own hands. And when Maria Prymachenko was about 9, she was struck down by polio. In the era before the polio vaccine was developed, it was a scourge particularly of children. And although she survived, she was left crippled. And that was extremely difficult for a young woman, a young peasant woman in this tiny village who can now no longer pull her weight in the fields. She cannot do the kinds of work that children were expected to do. She had 4 years of schooling as a child, in part because she could not be in the fields planting and harvesting, so she might as well get a little education. And she did watch the geese That was something that she could do, to be a geese herd. And she later told the story that one day she was in charge of the geese, and she had her stick, which she needed to walk with, but she was leaning on something and was scratching designs in the sand with her stick. The flowers, the oak leaves, the animal designs that she would have known. And she realized there was blue clay underneath the sand. And so when she was done with her workday, she gathered up that blue clay and brought it home and painted the interior of her house. And this was also a traditional female folk art in Ukraine, the painting of interiors, usually with blue and white, usually with floral patterns like the ones that you see here. And her neighbors, she was a teenager at the time, her neighbors saw this work and began to ask Maria to decorate their homes. And so she could earn her keep through exercising this ability of hers as a painter. And her very first payment was a piglet that helped her family get through the coming hard winter. So art making allowed this child with her disability to contribute to the family income. And that was very important because these were hard years in Ukraine. Ukraine had joined the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics in 1922. And at first, Lenin encouraged the various republics in their native folk art traditions. He encouraged the people to do the time-honored arts and crafts of their local regions. But under Stalin, that was repressed in favor of a Soviet uniformity. And in 1932, Stalin collectivized Ukrainian farming. And this was an absolute disaster for the people of Ukraine. This meant that peasants were no longer able to farm for themselves, not even a little cottage garden. They had to join collectives that had to hit certain production milestones before the peasants themselves were allowed to take any food for their own households. These production goals were so impossible, so inflated, that the Ukrainian peasants never got to take any food for themselves, and agriculture was thrown into complete chaos, and this terror famine, as it's called, the Holodomor, affected millions of Ukrainians. It is estimated that 3 million Ukrainians died in 32-33. And it was a state policy, and yet Stalin denied relief. So Prymachenko would have been in her early 20s. This is a photograph by a Ukrainian photographer of his family having spent 300 days without bread, eating their weak soup of mostly water. One of his sons went insane, another starved to death, and it's hard not to see echoes of this famine in some of Prymachenko's later works. So this is from decades later, 1939, from her corn cob series. A cow like that gives 5,000 liters a day. Well, that seemed like a lot to me, but I don't know. I'm from Seattle. So I Googled it. And do you all know what a healthy, productive cow produces daily? A well-producing cow at the height of her production might give 60 liters a day. So by titling this "A Cow Like That Gives 5,000 Liters a Day," Prymachenko is probably alluding to those production goals of 1932, 1933. To those absolutely unachievable, this idea that the Soviet collective had that the farms would produce, that cows could be made to produce 5,000 liters of milk a day, 100 times their natural production. And yet it is a bright, colorful image of a corncob decorated cow. Prymachenko could not walk well. She couldn't do hard labor in the fields, but she could embroider. And in the 1930s, her cousin in Ivankiv, which was the nearest town of any size, encouraged her to sell her embroidered goods at the local market there. This is not a Prymachenko embroidery. I was not able to find an example of any of her embroidered work. But this is the work of an original Ukrainian embroiderer that's not just a shirt and not just traditional patterns. And it's probably work like this that Prymachenko was doing that caught the eye of a weaver, Tetiana Floru, who invited Prymachenko to Kiev to study at the new experimental workshops of the Kiev Museum of Ukrainian Art. So artisanal Ukrainian folk traditions, even though they were being suppressed by Stalin, were being cultivated in Kiev. And she would attend these workshops that were transformed into the School of Folk Craftsmen, where her teachers were significant artists and designers like Vasil Krichevsky, who designed in 1918 the banknotes, the sort of Art Nouveau-inspired banknotes of the short-lived Ukrainian People's Republic. So these were the level of teachers that she had, and they encouraged her. And we see her here probably in one of her own embroidered shirts, because she was said only to wear garments made by her own hand, but they encouraged her to take up painting. And she showed work at the first Republican folk art exhibition in Kiev in 1936, an exhibition that then went on to Moscow and St. Petersburg. The kind of work that she was making were brilliant watercolors and gouaches, opaque watercolor, on paper, on a dark ground. So this is from 1936, a bird of prey. So it's lovely. We get all of these fun colors, brilliant blues and magentas, and birds and flowers, typical in a way Ukrainian motifs, and yet the big bird has the little bird in his beak, which could suggest the vulnerability of Ukraine in relation to the Soviet Union in large, with the Holodomor in such recent memory. There are also works that are more menacing looking, like this Black Beast, also from 1936. I mean, we can't obviously identify the species of either of these birds. Similarly, this, we can't even get to a particular kind of beast, and in fact it's not titled lion or monkey or bear, but simply Black Beast, with its spiky mohawk that goes all the way down its back and to its tail. Its teeth don't look particularly threatening, but it does seem to be a somewhat menacing creature, and even the plant is spiky. The flower's leaves are spiky. There were folk artists who were suppressed in these years, but Prymachenko never was, and it's thought that as a woman and a peasant, she seemed to present very little threat. But works like these were shown in 1937 at the Paris International Exposition, which featured a standoff between the Nazi pavilion, this big, blocking neoclassical building with a black eagle on it at left, and the Soviet pavilion. This building in a more stepped style, but with on top the workers, the farm worker and factory worker, moving forward into a brilliant future, a work by a female sculptor, Vera Mukina. So in that right-hand building would have been shown works like The Black Beast and The Bird of Prey by Prymachenko. And in 1937, Paris was still the center of the art world. Great artists would have attended this exhibition, and legend has it that Picasso remarked of Prymachenko's work, quote, "I bow down before the artistic miracle of this brilliant Ukrainian," end quote. Well, there's no record that Picasso ever actually said any such thing. He does seem to have seen and admired her work, but the flowery rhetoric is the brainchild of some Ukrainian patriot. But we can see how Prymachenko's work would have appealed to Picasso with its fantasy and its disavowal of traditional ways of rendering. And we can also see how it could have appealed to the other artist who is noted as having seen and admired Prymachenko's work in 1937. Oh, I should mention that 1937, at this very exhibition, this is where Picasso showed Guernica. So that's what's going on in the world at this time. And some websites will even tell you that it was Prymachenko's work that inspired Chagall to begin to paint animals in brilliant colors and flying through the sky and so forth, which is, again, puffery. Chagall had been painting green goats for a quarter of a century by this time. And yet, again, we can see how he too would have attended the Russian pavilion at the World's Fair, because that was his homeland. He would have wanted to see what the authorities were allowing Russian artists to create in those years. It was mostly socialist realism of a type that would not have appealed at all to Chagall or Picasso. And so Prymachenko's works would have come as a respite from all that official hammer and sickle art. In 1940, she made a series of watercolors that have stayed together that are now in the Adamovsky Foundation, like this dog serenading a bird, a dog that looks like something out of Chagall. Chagall frequently has animals playing musical instruments and the like. And we can see in this work Prymachenko's love of patterning, how she adapts certain patterns that were part of the embroiderer's vocabulary, the flowers, which here become wings or tail feathers, these strawberries with their dots, the pattern of dashes and dots on the fur of the dog and the bird, all testifying to her love of textural patterns. So this is a very light-hearted work. This initially appears a very light-hearted work. This two geese, there in the foreground, a kind of matching pair, one bowing its neck to eat, and again we get floral motifs, tree-like motifs, but here in the center, in the background, there is a fox eating a bird, possibly another goose, possibly a different kind of bird, it's hard to say. And yet we see the predator in the midst of Eden. And in fact, war was coming to Central Europe. And in 1940, Prymachenko moved back from Kiev to her native Bolotnia. Her lover, whom she had met in Kiev, went to the front lines, Infantry Lieutenant Vasily Marinchuk. And it is unclear whether or not he got the letter that informed him that Maria Prymachenko was bearing his child. The son, Fyodor, was born in 1941 in Bolotnia, but she never heard from her husband or lover. They didn't even have a chance to get married again. He was presumed lost in Finland. And her brother was executed by the Nazis. And in September 1941 in Kiev, more than 33,000 Jews were massacred by the Nazis and their bodies tossed into a ravine. Prymachenko in those years was working on a collective farm and had no colors to paint with. So between 1940 and 1947, there are no works extant by her hand. And her son remembered them hiding in trenches she had dug near their vegetable garden, near their home, when the fighting got close to Bolotnia. After the war, she took up colors again briefly. She made this blue bull, this sort of proud animal, symbol of power and yet at rest. Its tail is sort of the 8-pointed star that is so frequent in Ukrainian embroidery. It is coated with this pattern, again, drawn from embroidery motifs. She would make this lion on a bed. It's a marvelous image with the mane that goes all the way around the eyes and to the nose. Now you'll sometimes see online that Maria Prymachenko painted all of these animals, lions and monkeys and elephants, but she'd never been to a zoo. That's not actually correct. There was a zoo in Kiev in the 1930s when she was studying there, and she did have an opportunity to visit the zoo and see those animals, but she would continue to produce her own fantastic versions of these animals, as the one you see here that is on, on a good Ukrainian embroidered or appliqued bedspread there. And that lion was a motif that she would use again and again throughout her career. So we see it here in 1963, this lion that is traversing a field of red mushrooms. And here the mane does not go quite so far into the face, but the face looks rather humanoid, as if this lion has a mustache. And we suspect often that her animals may actually be caricatures of recognizable individuals, either in her life or in Ukrainian politics more broadly. The lion has broken an oak tree from 1963 is another motif that she would paint multiple times in her career. And this one refers to a Ukrainian story where the lion had to get across the river, but had to arrive in regal state, not bedraggled and muddy from walking across the river. And so the lion employed a branch of an oak tree, probably more a stream than a river, employed a branch of an oak tree, broke a great branch to lay it across the stream so that he could cross without harm. And so we see the bending of the branch, we see all of these tiny acorns, and within Ukrainian folklore, the lion is often not an admirable creature. There's one story about the lion becoming czar of all the animals, not through consensus, but rather through force and trickery. So again, we get this sense of a subversive message in Prymachenko's work. Between 1947 and 1959, I was unable to find any examples of her work. So there was a brief period after World War II where she returned to painting, and then she may have painted, but everything from the next dozen years has been lost. She was a single mother. She had undergone a couple of surgeries in Kiev in the 30s that allowed her to walk more comfortably with a cane, but she is still not able-bodied and is having to care for elderly parents, care for a child, feed them all from her garden, work on the collective farm, and so forth. Not a lot of leisure for painting. However, starting in 1959, she takes up her brushes again. So this is one of the earliest images I could find from that new period of her output, and it is a serpent, another dangerous creature reminiscent of the biblical serpent of Eden infesting the paradise of flowers with its flattery and lies. This is from 1962, and it has very typical, brilliant Ukrainian colors, this peacock among flowers. This work looks like it could have been done by a number of folk artists working in Ukraine in the 1960s. That cannot be said of most of Prymachenko's art. It is mostly utterly unique to her conceptions of animal life. This forest bird with its child can be no one but Prymachenko. Again, we get the mushrooms and some red flowers there on the right, and we hope that that owl-like creature is protecting and tending its offspring. But that red tongue allows for a divergent interpretation as well. Maybe she's grooming it, but maybe she's devouring it. And such stories are not unusual, and being part of the Soviet Union may have felt like being devoured. In 1963, she painted this rat on a journey. And we can imagine that this day she may have had just 3 colors in her paint box, a green, a black, and a white, and have created all of these range of greens, blacks, and grays with just those colors. Now this too seems to be a story from Ukrainian folklore, and unfortunately I was able to find very little of the stories, the inspiration for Prymachenko's art. But this seems to be Father Rat pulling his young on this sledge through the forest. Well, it is an utterly delightful work, so delightful that in 2007, it was adopted by Prymachenko artist Christina Isola for her textile design Forest Dwellers, which you see on the right. So you can see that Isola has eliminated Father Rat and the sledge and put in a couple of extra trees, but otherwise simply almost stroke for stroke, she has copied Prymachenko's work in this design. And then Thin Air decided to use that very design on a series of their Airbus airplanes. And it wasn't until 2013 that a Thin Air passenger who happened to own a catalog of Prymachenko and a very good eye noticed that that wasn't Finnish, that was Ukrainian, and wrote a letter, and it caused tremendous embarrassment for Thin Air and for Prymachenko. And the designer apologized rather abjectly. She said she found the work so charming, she wanted to share it more widely, but she acknowledged how wrong that was to do without crediting its original creator. Some of Prymachenko's work is very heraldic looking. Here again we find an oak tree central in this image of bears in a bee garden. But the bears almost look like the bears of a coat of arms. Bears, of course, a symbol of Russia. And here the bears are helping themselves to the fruit of the bees' labor. So this could be another image that we could interpret as the strong getting wealthy off the backs of the weak, the laborers being exploited by their overlords. But other Prymachenkos have little symmetry to them, like this murderous intruder in Eden, another allusion, perhaps, to the biblical snake, to evil that has arrived among the flowers, this strange two-headed, cock-crested beast. In Spring Revels of Hares and Birds, she gives us another image that would make a wonderful textile design, but an image that really shows us her absolute adoration of the Ukrainian countryside. And she would say, quote, "I love to paint how people work in the field, how young people walk like a poppy is blooming. I love all living things. I love the forest, flowers, various birds and forest animals. I dress them in folk clothes, and they are so funny with me, they already dance," end quote. And indeed, we can see her rabbits here all playing musical instruments and the pink birds enjoying that serenade. In 1966, Prymachenko won the Taras Shevchenko National Prize for Cultural and Artistic Works. And by this time, she had some important supporters in the art world, a Ukrainian critic, a Russian journalist, although for the most part, her works were painted for her neighbors. She gave them away or bartered them. She didn't consider herself a professional artist. But 2 years after receiving the Shevchenko Prize, she paid homage to him in this image. Taras Shevchenko arrives from his exile to flowering Ukraine. Shevchenko, seen here in a portrait made 10 years after his death, is considered the father of Ukrainian literature. But he was considered a dangerous separatist by the Tsarist monarchy and was exiled from Ukraine. He was also a painter and poet. One of his honorifics in Ukrainian is simply bard. And Prymachenko paints him as a bard with his lyre, returning from his exile to flowering Ukraine near the end of his life. And the flowers suggested by that range of floral motifs plucked from traditional embroidery patterns. And in these years, she is always working with a colored ground, no longer the white ground of her work from the 30s and 40s. The brilliance of the background adds to the expressive qualities of her works. Those supporters of hers were supplying her with modern art supplies, papers, and paints. So around 1970, she began experimenting with some new sorts of paints. These are fluorescent paints, I think particularly oranges and blues that are employed in this image of two pigeons drinking water by a windmill. And we see those fluorescent paints again in this much more dangerous looking image from 1978, "May nuclear war be cursed." And apparently, Prymachenko often wrote in her barely literate Ukrainian, she often wrote on the backs of her paintings a longer story or description, which unfortunately I could rarely find translated into English. But look at this creature, another beast with a forked tongue of snakes, again reminding us of the lies of the snakes of the Garden of Eden. But we've seen a lot of different decorative patterning. Here, the decorative patterns look like weapons. These look like warheads. And so she's incorporating her knowledge in Bologna of nuclear weapons to make this image in protest of such weapons and their tremendous destructive capability. And the fluorescent paints give it that even more otherworldly nuclear look. This Ukrainian ram did not gather his crop from 1976, and we imagine that this too is some sort of an allusion to a Ukrainian story, or potentially to current events in Ukraine, to some sort of agriculture minister who was faulty in doing his job. But we see, it's without knowing what it's about, we can still enjoy this image for its brilliant colors, its whimsy, the fun red hat with the polka dot design perched on the head of the ram, who seems to be wearing an earring and to have a sort of almost humanoid face. In 1979, she was doing that series that incorporated corn cobs. And this one is her corn cob horse in outer space. This image alludes to the space race between the United States and the USSR, but Prymachenko typically populates space with flowers. In 1979, she painted Fox Makes Friends with a Crane. And here I can finally give you a story for this work. A story that goes all the way back to Aesop. But in the fable of the fox and the crane, the two animals are hardly making friends. Fox decides to invite Crane to lunch, but serves soup in a bowl so shallow that Crane cannot get any of it into his bill. So Crane retaliates by reciprocating the invitation to lunch, but serving soup in such a tall, skinny vessel that Fox can only get his muzzle in a part of the way, not far enough to taste, only far enough to smell the delicious broth below. So these animals are not making friends. And what do we have at the exact center of this work but a tall vase? In other words, Prymachenko is aware of that story, of that source material. And yet, what she writes on the back is that Fox is making friends. So she downplays in her words the antagonism between these two creatures in the story, and even the marvelous designs on the crane's breast. The crane is almost dressed like a Ukrainian bride. And the fox is, of course, a dangerous and tricky creature in much folklore. But she says that this is about friendship. Now, some of her works in the 1980s are plainly celebratory. Works like The Flax in Bloom and The Girl Getting Married. Works in which she includes figures and embeds them in the landscape that she loved so much. Now, the tree of life, and we've seen a central tree motif in other of her works, that was an important motif within Ukrainian craft, embroidery, wood carving, and so forth. And here it holds this place of honor over the young couple who are dressed in their beautifully embroidered ceremonial wedding costumes. And just again, you can see the headdress of the bride, and look at the crane again. So they stand in front of the tree of life, which bears orange fruit. I don't think oranges grow in North Ukraine. These may be intended to be apples. It's hard to say specifically. They are a fruit, a symbol of fertility. And the flax fields are very schematic repetitions of a blue flower, a stem, and two V-like leaves. The two cranes heraldically approach one another on either side of the central tree. It's a lovely image in those colors that we know are those of the Ukrainian flag. In the same year, she painted this old man and old woman carry a turnip, which again has the persimmon tree, I don't know, but a pear tree at the center. That one is more recognizable, but here too is a folk story that I had heard. It was told to my children by their elementary school librarian. It's the story of the giant turnip that was grown by an old man, a peasant farmer. And having grown this miraculous turnip, he decided he wished to bring it to the capital as a gift for the king. Well, he couldn't pull it out of the ground. And so his wife, the old woman, wraps her arms around his torso and she tugs. And they still can't pull it out of the ground. So granddaughter grabs on and she tugs. And then dog. And then cat. And they cannot budge this enormous turnip until little mouse joins the line of tuggers. And the addition of little mouse allows them to finally free the turnip from the earth. And sure enough, we see exactly that in the procession. Yes, dog and cat look rather mouse-like too, but grandfather, grandmother, granddaughter, all part of this tale, which was told by Pushkin, among others. But it's this marvelous image that celebrates the contribution of the least of us. Now, the big-eared beast has caught a crayfish. I've seen described in a number of different translations, one of which refers to the astrological sign of Cancer, but it does look, again, we don't have the donkey, or this is not a named animal. This is, again, that imaginary, fantastical beast. More patterned birds in the sky, bluebells this time, wonderful patterning on the beast himself, but he's caught himself a crayfish that looks rather worried there in the lower right-hand corner. Her concerns are perhaps much more explicit in works like The Threat of War. What was written on the back of this one was, Mr. Reagan, look at this picture and think about how heavy and unreasonable this atom is, end quote. In other words, this is another work decrying nuclear war. It is another work with a frightening monster at its heart. This monster with very sharp teeth, and a monster that is devouring or about to devour that little fly creature. So this is yet another image of the powerful destroying the weak. And Prymachenko is always on the side of the underdog. Now this was the year, 1986, of the Chernobyl meltdown. And Bolotnia is 30 kilometers away from Chernobyl. It was, in other words, in the contamination zone, in the evacuation zone. And Prymachenko absolutely refused to evacuate. So she remembered that the authorities came around with cellophane bags and told the resident to put the bags over their feet to protect them from the soil. And you can imagine how Maria Prymachenko felt about that dictate. And to this day, levels of strontium in Bolotnian soils are sky high. But she made this image. An old man was grazing his cow near Unit 4. It was Unit 4 or Block 4 of Chernobyl that melted down. An old man was grazing his cow near Unit 4, dressed in capron bags to stay healthy. And it is feeding on the grass and not listening to him. So we see again the familiar trees of life, the apple trees. We see flax, blue flowers in the field. We see the peasant with his colorful embroidered costume, and the cow as well, wearing a colorful embroidered sort of wrap. But you'll notice that the peasant is going barefoot. However, in compliance with official dictates, he has placed the plastic bags around the feet of his cow and even around her tail and her horns so that he's in compliance with the regulations. So this is a work about, again, also notice the cow has one eye. So it's a mutant. And again, this is an image about authority and about peasant resistance to that authority. A resistance that might look like compliance, but is essentially an independence. She would make other images related to Chernobyl, including flowers grew near the 4th power unit, where the flowers look extremely carnivorous and mutant. But this particular work was auctioned in May in support of the Ukrainian armed forces. The starting price was $5,000, and it was purchased for $500,000. And the benefits went to military buses for transporting troops, and each one has emblazoned on it this symbol of the flowers growing near the 4th power unit. So she's making images about world events. She's making images like the cow giving 5,000 liters of milk, or feed me, this beast that is just devouring the smaller creatures that we see here, about the famine of her youth, about world events. Both her son and her two grandsons, whom she raised, would go on to be folk artists as well. And I love this photograph because it gives us a sense of the scale of Prymachenko's work and of the range of colors and motifs that she used. In 1982, she proposed to give this Ukrainian bread to all people in this big, wide world. So this image features the sunflowers that we now know are the symbol of Ukraine. And she imagines a younger version of herself with bread to share with the whole world. Well, it's not bread, it is her paintings that are being shared with the whole world. This one, the Ukrainian bull, 3 years old, went walking through the woods and gathers strength. So the bull, although it looks more like a piggy bank, honestly, is decorated with those Ukrainian floral motifs. The bull is walking through the woods and finding berries, maybe wild blueberries, but that walk through the woods, through nature, through the Ukrainian countryside, gives this bull strength. Prymachenko was recognized both during her lifetime and afterwards. 2009, the 100th anniversary of her birth, was declared Maria Prymachenko Year in Ukraine, and works like the Blue Bull, which we saw earlier, have adorned Ukrainian postage stamps. There was even a Prymachenko-themed playground opened in Kiev in August 2021. And here we see a little girl riding a three-dimensional evocation of one of Prymachenko's fantastical beasts. But her work is encouraging the people of Ukraine in new ways during their years of crisis, during the conflict which began in 2014 and intensified this February. In 1978, she painted "Our Army, Our Protectors." Do you see anything military in this work? No, because Prymachenko recognized that the Ukrainian army and Ukrainian protectors are the peasantry, the ordinary people, and that what makes them strong is their folk traditions, their traditional costumes, their love of these artisanal, cultural motifs that make up the Ukrainian identity. As it turned out, 14 of the 25 paintings that were in that museum in Ivankiv were rescued by locals who ran into the burning building to save her artwork from the flames. And recently, an exhibition was held in Lviv for just 4 days of those 14 Maria Prymachenko paintings. And people lined up around the block to pay their $1.35 to see these works that had been rescued by someone who understood their value to Ukrainian culture. And as the artist's great-granddaughter, Anastasia Prymachenko, said, quote, "The museum was the first building in Ivankiv the Russians destroyed. I think it is because they want to destroy our Ukrainian culture," end quote. And the Ukrainians are fighting back. 2 of Prymachenko's works were included in the Venice Biennale this fall. among the selection of Ukrainian contemporary artworks, one of those was this boxers that uses, again, that symmetrical heraldic composition that she often employed. But again, there is this, this undertone of conflict. Prymachenko's dove has been used in a variety of protests against the war. So Prymachenko's work, with its sly subversiveness, with its celebration of nature, of folklore, and of Ukrainian craft tradition, has become an important rallying point for the Ukrainian people. And all around the world, the dove asking for peace has become a symbol of resistance to that illegal war and of the hope that the Ukrainians prevail in this fight for their culture and their sovereignty. Thank you. Are there questions or images you would like a second look at? How many of you had heard of Maria Prymachenko before you saw the announcement for this series? One, that's about what I would have expected. Yes?
It's interesting that when we have this wood ring show at the same time, it's kind of fantastic beasts and images of just kind of...
I haven't seen it yet because, as you saw, I was running in from the 10:25 ferry. But yeah, it's a wonderful confluence of ideas and energies, if there's something similar.
What was the question?
Oh, I know.
It was just a statement that this made me think of the wood ring exhibit that's going on right now.
Yes, in the back.
I was curious if Morris Sendak had ever seen her work.
Oh, what a good question. If Maurice Sendak had ever seen her work. I do not know the answer to that, but I do know that in the 1970s, she illustrated a couple of Ukrainian children's books. I wasn't able to get visuals for those to show you. And of course, her work is perfect for illustrating children's books. And there is, I believe, now a children's book about her life and work. But I don't know if Sendak was familiar with her work or not. Yes?
I just want to say how much I appreciate all your research that you bring to us.
Thank you. This talk turned out to be particularly challenging to research. I checked out the one book on Maria Prymachenko in the UW library, and it's in Ukrainian with a 2-page summary in English, French, and German at the back. I did a lot of feeding Ukrainian text from the internet into Google Translate. So yes, it was a little more challenging than the usual lecture, but it seemed timely and important to look at the life and work of this woman who experienced the hardships of 2 world wars and 1 mass famine and terrible political strife during her life, and yet made these works that are so colorful and charming, and yet also potentially political and subversive, given what is going on right now in her homeland. It seemed a good time to take a look at her work. And now that you know her, you will start seeing it. For instance, I mentioned to a friend of mine that I would be giving a lecture on a Ukrainian folk artist, and she said, "Oh, is it the one that was in, I think this is Interiors magazine?" And she subscribes to this magazine for her love of design porn, as she calls it, looking at marvelous interior design. And recently, they featured on the very last page a one-page object lesson on Prymachenko's work. And the work that they chose to highlight is the one with the cow wearing the cellophane bags on its feet. So you will start seeing her images on the internet and in various places now that you are aware of her. Next month, I can't remember what I'm talking about, so if someone could remind me, that would be delightful. Or I will check my calendar. So next month, am I here next month, or am I not? It's possible I'm not here until December. But I'm doing a lot of fun stuff in this series. So even if you don't know the artist's name, I hope that you will come and learn. December 21st, I will be speaking about Hendrik Overkamp, a Dutch artist well known in the Netherlands, a Dutch artist of the era of Rembrandt who specialized in ice scenes, snow scenes of whole villages out on the ice in the snowy landscape, who also happened to be a deaf artist. So I hope you will come back in December on the 21st. You'll all be hopefully home for the holidays and can join me for that. Thank you.